Globally, COVID-19 has infected nearly 3 million people. Sadly, around 200,000 have died. Millions have lost their jobs. Airlines and businesses have gone to the wall. And as a result, economists believe we are on the edge of a deep recession or even a depression. And we all just want to get out of lockdown. But what's next? What does the future hold? And can we know? Is there any hope?
Good evening and welcome to our third night of Predictions of Hope Beyond Corona, brought to you by the Hope Channel. I'm your host Rebecca, and it's a pleasure to have you join us again tonight. Last night, we had another two incredible presentations from our speakers Gary Webster and Robbie Bergen. We saw in Health, Wellness and Corona that the ancient prophetic writings of the Bible are not only historically accurate and prophetically reliable, they contain tips for helping build our immune systems. And then, in The Last Empire, we looked at that remarkable prediction that once again pinpoints names, places, characteristics, and the succession of 4 world empires, and even describes the very world we're living in today. In case you missed any of the topics so far, you can catch up on our website, hopechannel.com/predictions of hope. Tonight, once again, at the end of our program, I'll be letting you know the code word to claim your free DVD. So stay tuned for the details on how to claim your free gift. Now let's get into our quest for hope beyond Corona. Gary Webster will be the first presenter, and he'll be looking at the fascinating topic of Jerusalem Countdown.
Thank you, Rebecca, and glad to be with you again this evening in Predictions of Hope Beyond Corona. In this presentation, we're going to be looking at Jerusalem Countdown and psychic certainty. What's all that about? Well, let's go back to Jerusalem 2,000 years ago. There was a great temple in Jerusalem at that time, built by Herod the Great. It's called Herod's Temple. Now, Herod did a lot of building in the Middle Eastern world when he was here. For example, you can go to Caesarea and you'll see his palace here, and you'll also see the great aqueduct that he made to have water brought to this great city where the Romans lived, who operated and ruled over the area of Palestine when they were here. Herod also built a number of fortresses, one called Herodian near Bethlehem, another one at Masada, a very famous fortress, and another one over in Jordan called Macarius. This was the place where John the Baptist was beheaded, tragically. And Herod was a ruthless man. He had a lot of fortresses, he had a lot of enemies. But you know, Caesar Augustus once said, it's better to be Herod's pig than his sons, because he was ruthless even to his own family. Now, Herod's temple of the first century was here when Jesus the Christ came. Now, I'm sure you've all heard of Jesus. He was made famous recently by Mel Gibson in his blockbuster movie, The Passion of the Christ. The first century is when these documents that talk about Jesus and the predictions we're going to look at in a moment were written. We know they date back to these times, but are they historically accurate? What do we know about their historicity? Well, let's answer that by looking at, first of all, was Jesus a real person? Was there such a person who actually lived 2,000 years ago? Well, we know he was from a number of reasons. Because non-Christian historians wrote about him, and non-Christian historians had no axe to grind. They weren't trying to prove a point, they weren't trying to prove Christianity, they were just writing about the events. For example, here's what some of these historians wrote. Thallus, 52 AD, just about 20 years after the death of Jesus, he wrote about the death of Jesus, not a Christian. Then there was Serapion, a Syrian, 73 AD, he wrote about the death or the execution of the king of the Jews. A more famous one was this man known as Flavius Josephus, a Jewish soldier who turned side and joined the Romans and wrote about the campaign that the Romans had. This historian, living 37 to 97 AD, wrote something very interesting about Jesus of Nazareth. He says, "Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, for he was a doer of startling deeds, Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men among us, condemned him to the cross. Now that's pretty much what the biblical records tell us, in fact. And this man wasn't a Christian. Probably one of the most famous was Tacitus. Now Tacitus was a Roman historian living 55 to 120 AD, actually regarded as the greatest historian of ancient Rome. And notice what Tacitus wrote. Christus, from whom the name had its origins, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. Now again, that's pretty much what you'll read in this book, those details. So from the non-Christian historians, we see that this person actually did exist. But we have something else. Archaeology actually also supports the historicity of the New Testament, supports some of the characters that are mentioned. Here's one of them. Remember, we were back here a moment ago at Caesarea, just next to this amphitheatre some years ago, they discovered a very famous stone known as the Pilate stone, because on it, it talks about Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea. This man certainly existed. The non-Christian historians wrote about him. He was the man who tried Jesus, condemned him to death, and now we've found evidence of him too. But an interesting one was one of the high priest who tried Jesus before he sent him to Pilate, a man by the name of Caiaphas. Just a few years ago, they discovered the ossuary of Caiaphas. What's an ossuary? Well, in ancient times, when a person died in Jewish culture, they put him in a tomb, the body decomposed, then they gathered the bones together and they put him in a box. A bone box is what an ossuary is, and this is the ossuary of Caiaphas himself. So historians do not doubt that there was a man called Jesus of Nazareth. Historically accurate, again, the biblical records. So we see historically accurate. The stories about Jesus were real events. Archaeology has supported that. Now, Jesus came to Herod's temple in the 1st century. And I want you to notice what happened. We read of many times he came in and out of this temple of Herod, but on one particular occasion, his followers were giving him a little tiki tour of the temple, showing him the magnificent buildings and parts of the temple, because it was one of the most amazing structures in the ancient world at this time. Jesus said to them as they're touring the temple, "Do you not see all these things? Assuredly I say to you, not one stone shall be left here upon another that shall not be thrown down." Now they could hardly believe their ears. And so they asked him this question when they came up here to the Mount of Olives some few hours later, sitting up here. They asked him this question. "Tell us," they said, "when will these things be? When's that going to happen, that the temple will not be left with one stone upon another?" Jesus then began to give them predictions concerning 3 things. Number 1, Jerusalem, the temple, and the Jewish nation. He gave 5 very specific predictions that we can check up on, and we'll do that. Number 1, he said, Jerusalem would be surrounded by an embankment, that's a wall, and it would be destroyed. Now, just a few days before this, he had actually come up here to the Mount of Olives as he's on his way into the city of Jerusalem on a donkey. I want you to notice what he said. Now, as he drew near, that's near Jerusalem, he saw the city and he wept over it, saying, why is he weeping? Notice, days will come upon you when your enemies will build an embankment. That's a wall, as we saw, around you. They'll surround you and close you in on every side and level you and your children within you to the ground. Number 2, Jesus said the temple would be totally destroyed. We already saw that just a few moments ago when he took that tiki tour. Not one stone here will be left upon another. That's the second prediction he makes from the Mount of Olives here. Now, some of these stones that you see in the temple that made up the temple complex are massive. These are typical Herodian stones when you see this little bevel here like that. And you can see how long this one stone is. I've seen stones much bigger than that. You go underneath the wall and you'll see massive stones. Some stones that built, this is just the retaining wall, by the way. the temple was built on top, but Herod did all this. 20 metres by 2 metres by 3 metres, that's a piece of rock, isn't it? The temple was made up of some massive stones on top of this structure, the retaining wall. Number 3, Jesus said the Jews would fall by the sword. Notice his prediction. There will be great distress in the land and wrath against this people. They will fall by the sword, tragically. On the road to the cross, we call it the Via Dolorosa. You can walk today the path that they believe he took. Well, that's the traditional idea. But on the road to the cross, he met some women who were crying because they saw what was going on, how he was suffering. I want you to notice what he said to them. And a great multitude of the people followed him, and women who also mourned and lamented him. But Jesus, turning to them, said, Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For indeed the days are coming in which they will say, Blessed are the barren wombs that never bore, and the breasts which never nursed. What a picture. Jesus, though suffering from terrible pain, he stops to tell these women, don't cry for me, but cry for yourself, because I can see what's going to happen down the track, in actual fact, 40 years into the future. Number 4, the Jews were to be scattered among the nations, Jesus said. Notice his prediction. They will fall by the sword and will be taken as prisoners to all the nations. Finally, Jesus predicted the Gentiles, the non-Jews, would inhabit the city of Jerusalem. An amazing prediction here. Watch what he says. And Jerusalem will be trampled by Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Now, the times of the Gentiles in the biblical records is a reference to the end times, the times in which we're living. So down to that time, this is what we'll be taking. Non-Jewish people will inhabit the city of Jerusalem. Now the question is this: were these predictions that Jesus made so long ago here on the Mount of Olives and inside the temple, were they actually fulfilled? What evidence do we have? What has archaeology discovered that help us? Well, we now know what took place. In 66 AD, Gessius Florus, the Roman leader there in Jerusalem, he wanted to take a temple tax from the Jews. They didn't want to do that. There was a great upheaval and many Jews were slaughtered. But eventually the Jews rose up and they massacred the Roman garrison. Cestius Gallus was sent by the Romans to put down the revolt. The Romans weren't going to take this sitting down. So they sent him to put down this revolt. He surrounded the city of Jerusalem very quickly. He had it on the ropes, actually. He could have really finished this thing off. But for some strange reason, he withdrew his soldiers. And this brings us to a very important prediction and a warning that Jesus had given. Christ had actually warned his followers as he sat on the Mount of Olives what to do at this time when the city would be surrounded. Notice what he says. And when you shall see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation is near. Then let them which are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let them which are in the midst of it, inside the city, depart out of it. And let not them that are in the country regions go into the city. Now here's a question. How on earth do you flee a city when it's surrounded? That's impossible. Well, this is what took place. You see, when those soldiers of Cestius Gallus withdrew, and the Jewish soldiers chased after them, and they had a big fight down the road further, way down. And the Christians inside the city remembered the words of Jesus. And that's when they escaped. They fled the city at that time. And they came over here to Pella, and many of them survived what was going to take place next, because the Romans came back. Vespasian was sent by the Emperor of Rome, who was Nero at this time, to really stop this rebellion. Vespasian came down with many soldiers. They began to attack the towns and the villages. But then Nero died, and Vespasian had a fight to become the emperor. He wanted to get control of Rome, and so he eventually became the emperor after they had some toing and froing there over who was going to be the leader on the throne, and Vespasian becomes the emperor. So he lets Titus now take over this fighting that's taking place in Palestine. So now Titus is the leader of the Romans. Titus besieged Jerusalem in 70 AD. 4 years have gone by in this great revolt of the Jews. What does Titus do? Titus starves the Jews. How does he do it? Well, he builds a 5-mile earthen rampart right around the city of Jerusalem. What did Jesus say? What did he predict some 40 years before? That's exactly what will take place. They'll build an earthen rampart, a wall around the city. And we know these documents go back before this time. They were written before Jerusalem was destroyed. We know that very clearly. Josephus tells us in his records that 1 million Jews perished in the siege. How did they die? Because you see, first of all, before the Romans came back, the Jews fought each other for control of their rebellion. Then when the Romans came and the fighting took place, many Jews were slaughtered. In fact, the Jews have suffered terribly ever since those times, tragically. You think of what took place in this place, Auschwitz. I take people here. So 1 million people sadly perished here in Auschwitz alone. On top of that, another 5 million elsewhere, sadly killed by the Nazis in the Second World War. Suffered many times down through history. Jesus certainly got that right, tragically, what took place there. The Jewish last stand, so to speak, was going to take place in this area here, because this is the temple complex. The temple was the symbol of Jewish nationalism and pride, this place here, which is why the Romans built that fortress called the Antonia. And as the fighting went on, the Romans took that, they destroyed the Antonia, and this is one of the last places that the Jews stood to fight here in Jerusalem. This was sort of like their last stand. Not quite, but certainly this was the main area of the last fighting. The Romans came in here and they tried to take the temple from the Jewish people. Hard fighting took place in this very place. Many lives were lost. Titus had told them not to destroy the temple because it was a magnificent building, but one of the soldiers threw a firebrand into the temple and it went up in smoke. Killed many people, and the fighting that took place was terrible, Josephus records us for us. But you know, when the fighting was over and the fire had gone out, the Romans wanted to get the gold and silver because there was a lot of gold and silver in that temple, and it had melted and ran down between the cracks of the rocks. And so they tore the rocks apart, tore them from each other to get at the gold and silver, and eventually not one stone left upon another in the temple complex. In fact, you can see, as archaeologists have been excavating here in Jerusalem, you can see some of these massive stones that have been thrown down. These were the stones of the temple complex on top of the retaining wall. Some of the shops that people would have gone to exchange their money, buy animals to go up onto the Temple Mount to do their sacrifices. This is what the archaeologists have found, exactly what the Bible said. Not one stone left upon another. They found some of that rubble down at the bottom there. When you visit the Temple Mount today, you see very clearly it's a flat area. These are buildings that were built much later, 700, 800 AD by the Muslims. This place is great evidence for the fact of what Jesus said. Not one stone left upon another. If you ever visit Rome, make sure you go to see the Roman Forum in the heart of Rome, and you visit the Arch of Titus. This is the Victory Arch commemorating the Roman conquest of the Jews at this time. If you look underneath the arch, you will see the Romans carrying away the 7-branched candlestick, the menorah, one of their trophies in this terrible fight with the Jewish people. And of course, there's no Jewish temple today in Jerusalem. Hasn't been ever since this temple was destroyed. Well, the Jews revolted yet again against the Romans about 70 years later in what's known as the Bar Kokhba revolt. Hadrian, the emperor, was the emperor at the time, and after this fight, and the Romans had won yet again, he said enough is enough, and the Romans drove the Jews pretty much out of Palestine, and they were scattered around the world from this time onward especially. And today when you visit the great cities of the world, cities like New York and London and Moscow, there are more Jewish people living in the cities of this world than are actually living in Israel today. You see, Jesus surely got it right. They would be scattered among the nations of the world. And of course, it's the Gentiles, it's the non-Jewish people that inhabit Jerusalem mainly today. When you go to Jerusalem, the old city I'm talking about, that the Bible is talking of, you will see there's a section for the Armenians, they're not Jews, the Christians, they're not Jews, and the Muslims, they're not Jews. 4 sections, 1 section for the Jews. Most of the old city is inhabited by non-Jewish people today. Jesus certainly got it right. And of course today it's the Palestinian Arabs that control the sacred Temple Mount, the most sacred site to the Jewish people, where their temple once stood. The Palestinians control that. You see, the predictions of Jesus concerning Jerusalem, the temple, and the Jewish nation were absolutely correct. So all of these predictions were fulfilled precisely, as you can see. You know, it's amazing when you think that Jesus made those predictions so long ago. But he made more than just predictions concerning the old city of Jerusalem and how it is even today. He made predictions concerning the very times in which you and I are living in. And we'll be sharing some of those briefly here. He also gave the book of Revelation. It was him that gave those predictions to John. And we have an amazing and exciting series coming up called Hope Awakens. A very good friend of mine, John Bradshaw, will be presenting that series. And you'll just be amazed at what his predictions concerning where we are today. So you won't want to miss that series. Make sure you stay tuned to the end of this program so you can get the details for that. Rebecca will be giving them to us. So Rebecca, over to you now.
We're really starting to see a pattern in these presentations, that these ancient manuscripts just keep getting things right. And not just here and there, but consistently. But more than that, in showing us that the predictions of Jesus are absolutely dependable, Gary has set us up for some high-octane predictions made 2,000 years ago by Jesus that reveal just how near the end really is. In our next presentation tonight, Robbie's going to take us to the future. And by looking at predictions made almost 2,000 years ago, he will share with us what is on the horizon as we look at global economic meltdown.
Thanks, Rebecca. In early 1999, me and my best friend at the time decided we wanted to go and do our overseas experience. We decided we're going to pack up everything and backpack around Europe for 6 weeks. The plan was pretty simple. We're going to go to as many countries and visit as many cities as was possible to cram into those 6 weeks period. But as part of our planning, our travel agents told us, you boys need to get yourselves some traveler's checks. So we went to the bank, gave them a bunch of cash, and in return got these traveler's checks of US dollars to take on our trip to Europe. Because in Europe, in 1999, every country had their own currency. And so to make it easy, you would take traveler's checks to go in between the different countries. And that was until the end of 1999, just before I was about to leave on my trip, I received a letter from my bank at the time saying, "Congratulations, Mr. Bergen, you are now in possession of the latest ATM key card. And if you look carefully on the key card, you'll find this plus logo on it. And that means that you are now a part of a global banking network which will enable you to access your Australian money in local currency anywhere in the world where you find an ATM with this plus logo." When I went to Europe, sure enough, I found these ATMs with the plus logo, and I was able to withdraw my local Australian currency with my Australian PIN number from my savings account in the local currency of the country I was visiting. You see, what had happened in 1999, a global banking network was established because of the latest advent of the internet. And this worldwide banking network enabled for real-time monetary transfer and data checking between banks and countries and accounts. Absolutely remarkable. 20 years later, we think, well, that's ancient history now. We're all used to tap and go and these sorts of things. An American author and commentator by the name of Thomas Friedman, wrote a book in the 1990s called The Lexus and the Olive Tree. This book has become a bestseller on the topic of globalization. When he wrote this book in the 1990s, from where he was standing, not from a religious perspective, just purely from looking at the society that was developing around us in the 1990s, he concluded that there were three driving factors that were pushing the world into what he called a global village. We'd call today globalization. The three factors he identified are these. Number one, he says that the democratization of technology is driving us into a new era of globalization. What does he mean by this? He means that technology is becoming more and more accessible. Think about this. Back in the 1990s, in that decade, we went from the start of the decade to the end of the decade from basically no home PCs to just about everyone having PCs, with no internet to having the internet. And what Thomas Friedman says in his book is that because of the accessibility now of technology, people are now able to be connected with people wherever they want, whenever they want, and however they want. That was the first factor he could see. If we keep going down this path, we're going to be a connected global village. Now, 20 years later, we go, well, that's a no-brainer. We're totally connected through technology. But the second factor he identifies is the democratization of finances. What does he mean by this? He could see that by the end of the 1990s, we were moving into a space where access to finance was becoming much easier for the average person. Think about this. Back in just 20 to 30 years ago, to buy a car or to buy a computer required you being basically good friends with your local bank manager. These days, if you don't like one bank, you go to another bank. If you don't like that bank, you go to another bank. You can get money wherever and whenever you want, and you can buy anything you want. You don't even have to have the money now. If you want the latest iPhone or a tablet or computer, you can just get it. You can pay after the fact. So what he was saying is that because finance is becoming more and more accessible, it's enabling more and more people to get the technology to allow us to be connected. The third factor he identifies is the democratization of information. What does he mean by this? In the 1990s, with the advent of the internet, it was becoming more and more possible for people to be in touch with events in almost real time. Today, it's absolutely real time. You know, you could be on Twitter and see real-time updates from press conferences on the other side of the planet. You can be on Facebook and see videos posted live from other parts of the planet. So with these three factors, Thomas Friedman says in his book that we are moving towards a global village. Today, we're in that global village, no question about it. But in his book, he also identifies two fears that he has with this pushing towards a global village. Number one, he says that there is a great fear because there is an opportunity for global economic control. As we become technologically connected, financially connected, and information connected, there is a chance for a group of people, or worse yet, an individual, to globally control our economy. That was his first fear in the 1990s. The second fear is, he states, there is a possibility of a global economic collapse. Now think about this. This was written in the 1990s. Just within a space of 10 years, we had the 2008 GFC, the global financial crisis, which a lot of the world was still sort of trying to recover from until we were hit with what we're experiencing now with COVID-19 and the effects it's having on our global economy. So the two fears that he highlights, we've already tasted some of those fears. You know, with the GFC, they said that the Americans sneezed economically and the rest of the world caught an economic cold. That's the kind of world that we're living in. Definitely a global village. Definitely globalization has taken its roots into the world in which we live. Now, many are asking, does these predictions of these ancient manuscripts, do they say anything about the economy? Now, you're going to be a little bit disappointed because I'm going to say they do, but these predictions don't really talk about the sorts of things you're probably hoping they do. How to grow your wealth or how to protect your investments. Doesn't really cover those things. But there are definitely predictions in these ancient manuscripts regarding the economy. Most people, when they think of biblical predictions, they think of things like the mark of the beast, the injection of some sort of RFID chip into the hand, or worse yet, a tattooed barcode on your forehead. These are all the symbols and ideas that come to mind when people think of economic prophecy. Now, these come from the book of Revelation. The book of Revelation is written by John, a disciple of Jesus, the same Jesus that gave those predictions in Gary's presentation we just saw, talking about Jerusalem, the temple, and the scattering of the people. That's the same Jesus that John claims gave the insight to this book of Revelation. Now, John claims that these predictions in Revelation, they deal with events starting in his time around 96 AD, all the way down to what he calls the end of time. Now, the book of Revelation has many sub-themes and plots and narratives in the story, but the overarching story in this book is the story of a great cosmic conflict between the forces of good and evil. Now, the Revelation describes that these events started long before our time, but it also makes the claim that this will wrap up sometime in a not too distant future. Now, of all of these overarching stories, one of the subplots is economics, or I should probably say global economics. The global economic parts of Revelation are specifically in these middle chapters here in the book. To get our bearings with these economic predictions, we're introduced to three characters. We're introduced to this dragon figure, and then this composite beast coming up out of the sea, and then this lamb-like beast coming up out of the earth. Now, we're not going to have a lot of time to go through all these symbols, so I want to encourage you to sign up for the program that's going to follow in another week from now. Rebecca's going to give you the details at the end of this presentation, so stay tuned. Now, back to these three characters. So we're introduced to this first beast, the dragon. The dragon is the architect in the story. He's the one behind the scenes with the overarching plan, and he's sort of pulling the strings. Notice what the prediction says about him. The dragon gave him his power, his throne, and great authority. He's the one with the real calling the shots behind the scene. That brings us to our second character, the sea beast. The sea beast is the puppet for the architect, that dragon. He's the one who's going to put on the face to the show. Notice what it says about him. Then I stood on the sand of the sea, and I saw this beast rising up out of the sea, and all the world wondered and followed the beast, and they worshipped the beast. Incredible. This beast, this character, is the one that's going to try and obtain worship from the world. Notice this now. And authority was given him over every tribe, tongue, and nation. The third character we saw was this lamb-like beast coming up out of the land or the earth. This one is the muscle in the story. He's the one that uses economics, he uses military, he uses his governance to force the world to get in harmony, get on the same page with the second character, who is really just the puppet for the architect behind the story. What does this third beast do? It says when he comes up out of the earth, he exercises all the authority of the first beast in his presence, and he causes the earth and those who dwell in it to worship that first sea beast. It continues on and says, he causes all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hand or on their foreheads, that no one may buy or sell except the one who has the mark or the name of the beast or the number of his name. When we look at that prediction regarding the muscle, the hired help of that earth beast, notice these three characteristics. No one may buy or sell except. When we break this down, we find something remarkable. No one is actually talking about the entire planet, global. No one can do something if you don't go along with the system. So there's no one is actually talking about everyone, global. The second characteristic is buy or sell. Well, that's clearly economic, financial, trade, finances, economy. So we have global, economic, and then the last one here is the word except. If you have something, you can go along. If you don't have something, you're not going to go along. And so we end up with control. So in this prediction, Revelation, John claims this came from that Rabbi Jesus that we saw in Gary's presentation. John is claiming that Jesus is telling him that there's going to be global economic control right before the end. Now remember Thomas Friedman? Remember his concern of a globalized world? Global economic control was one of the things he was worried about. It's almost like he saw what is painted here in Revelation. Now, in order to have this global economic control, you probably need two ingredients. Number one, a global financial system, and number two, some kind of controllable currency system. With these two things, you could in fact have global economic control. When we're talking about the global financial system, remember my story from 1999? A global financial system was created and currently exists. So that one's been ticked off already. Let's have a look at the second characteristic we would need, or second ingredient we would need, a controllable currency system. Do we see a controllable currency? Well, right now we don't, but notice these news reports. Sydney Morning Herald in 2018, cashless future is here, with coins and banknotes becoming niche. How about this one from the New Daily in July 2018? Australia's path to a cashless society is accelerating and inevitable. ABC News said in 2018, regulators are pushing us into a cashless world as the RBA declares a turning point has been reached. Absolutely incredible that we are already on this trajectory towards a controllable cashless society. We continue on. The Reserve Bank of Australia in 2018 said a journey towards a near cashless payment system. This is the replacement for the FPOS network. NPP is the acronym they use. Here we see the rise of cashless society sees coin sales plummet for the Royal Australian Mint. Then we see business appeal of tap and go is at the end of cash. An article there on how a number of inner city cafes and restaurants are refusing to accept cash, but we continue on. With the advent now of the coronavirus, notice what the world is saying. Coronavirus could speed up an introduction to a cashless society. That's in March 2020, just a few weeks ago. Coronavirus fears from the ABC News means shops are accepting card payments only. And the question is this the end of cash? Here is a graph in the same article showing that from 2007 to 2019, there has been a steady decline in the use of cash in transactions and an increase with digital currency. The Sydney Morning Herald reported in April 2020 that the coronavirus will accelerate the trend towards a cashless society. Here we see in April 2, cashless after COVID-19. Here's another one from Forbes. Now, a part of the American stimulus package in order to combat the coronavirus effect on the economy, the draft bill presented to the Senate actually cites that there is a need for a digital dollar and a digital wallet. It shows up in the bill. Now, in the final, it was removed, but in the draft, it was there. And Forbes magazine jumped on it in March 2020. And then March 30, at the end of the month, they came back and said, should our societies go cashless? This is a question that's actively happening, and it's being accelerated because of the coronavirus that we're facing right now. Forbes also continues on saying, forget the coronavirus stimulus bill's digital dollar, the digital euro is coming. There is a battle between the Europeans and the Americans to arrive with the first digital currency, a controllable currency. But then we find this, why the US should not let China dominate the digital currency race. This is April 2020. We now have three world powers, China, Europe, and the US, all racing, trying to achieve the first digital currency, which will eventually replace this idea of cash that we are all used to. So when we look at these two ingredients necessary for this prediction to become true, we are on the verge of that last ingredient, a controllable currency, becoming reality. It's almost like the book of Revelation was describing the very near future of the time in which we are living right now. Now, this global alliance that Revelation describes coming together to bring this agenda to the forefront, it seems like it's pretty bad news, right? To any logically thinking person. But it's interesting because in this prediction, It goes on and says that as this agenda and alliance is sort of brought to the forefront, something happens. Notice this. Therefore her, that's this alliance, her plagues will come in one day. Something about this alliance coming together, this controllable currency, this global financial system will invoke some kind of collapse. Notice this statement. For in 1 hour your judgments have come, and their merchants of the earth will weep and mourn over her, for no one buys their merchandise anymore. We've seen through the course of this series of presentations that these ancient manuscripts seem to have incredible accuracy. Even though most of them were written 2,600 years ago, we are seeing a world right now that's depicted by these ancient predictions. Is the future that these predictions describe becoming our reality? If we look once again at these predictive elements in the story, we find that we are living in a time and place where all of the ducks are being lined up in a row. Absolutely remarkable. But the question is, so what? What's the purpose of these prophecies? That's the question, because sometimes these prophecies are kind of gloom and doomish, right? I mean, that's what most people interpret these economic prophecies and these ancient predictions. These predictions are not given to create fear. In fact, it's the opposite. Notice this. These are the words of that same Rabbi Jesus that gave those predictions we saw in Gary's last presentation. Jesus says, and now I have told you before it happens. The it here are these predictions. He says, I've told you before it happens that when it does come to pass, you may believe. These are supposed to bring comfort because now we know what's happening as it takes place. It gives us an idea that someone and something is out there. We're not all here just by ourselves and alone. In fact, the Old Testament puts it this way. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future. Once again, as we've looked at these amazing predictions, we're seeing that the things in the world are lining up right now to get us into a position where these predictions could be easily fulfilled. Now the question is, once again, are we dealing with some kind of hoax? Is this just someone's way of creating some fear amongst us? Is it just a hoax? Or are we actually dealing with something that is supernatural? Are we actually dealing with these predictions coming from, as Daniel claims and as John claims, from some supernatural being out there? If that's true, then these prophecies and these predictions require, if not demand, our attention.
What an amazing snapshot of the future. It's almost like the book of Revelation was written for our day. Now, as you heard tonight, we're excited to announce that we will have a sequel to the series coming up, and it's called Hope Awakens. International speaker John Bradshaw will be presenting this unique series. He'll share even more incredible predictions of Daniel and the Revelation that reveal we are living in incredible times. It starts this coming Friday, May 15 at 7:30 p.m. You will need to register to get access to this virtual event. To register, go to hopechannel.com/Hope Awakens and fill out the details. Now, before we go, once again, we'd love to get some great resources into your hands. We want to offer you the award-winning DVD called Beyond Belief. All you have to do is text tonight's code word FUTURE to +61 428 833 386 and follow instructions. Again, text tonight's code word FUTURE to +61 428 833 386 and follow the instructions. It's as simple as that. Join me tomorrow night at 7:30 p.m. as we explore further with the topics of global warnings, how near is the end, and horizons of hope, today, tomorrow, and you, as we continue to look for predictions of hope beyond Corona. Good night.